Okay, here we go, and welcome. So like I was saying, my name is Brian. I'm the program manager of Recovery Cafe Jefferson County. Welcome to our monthly volunteer training. We have this on the third Friday of every month. We're doing it via Zoom lately. It's always at 10 a.m. to 11:30. If you haven't already, you can register for future trainings on our website, and I'll put that in the chat, but it is recoverycafejc.org. Today, the topic is Addiction 101, and I've asked a guest, a colleague of mine from when I had worked at Safe Harbor Recovery Center here in Port Townsend, Angel. Would you mind introducing yourself a little bit, Angel?
Sure. So like you said, I'm Angel. I know it says Angelica. I think when I registered it, that's what I put my real name, but Angel's what I've always gone by. And as you said, I'm a counselor at Safe Harbor. I've been here about 15 years. I'm licensed as a substance use disorder professional, they call it now, and then also as a licensed mental health counselor. So I primarily work with the clients with co-occurring disorders. So that's me. I grew up in Port Townsend. I actually graduated from Port Townsend High School. Moved away for a while for college, but came back.
Thanks, Angel. So with the number of people that we have, I wanted to, like I said, keep it really brief, but I would love to just have your name and I think like just 1 minute, really, like 60 seconds on what brings you to today's training. So I'm going to go ahead and call you so that we don't have too much delay in between people. Okay, so the order, I'll start with just the first few people. We'll do Susanna, Tom, then Annie. So go ahead, Susanna.
Okay. I'm Susanna Lewis. My ancestors started coming here in the 1800s. I feel very connected to this, and it's, since I'm largely Celtic, I can feel those connections, and it's a great field to be connected. I was in healthcare for 35, 40 years, and I can't not want to reach out and help someone that I can see needs help. So I'm looking forward to learning about what this addiction is more than what I know. Thank you.
Thank you. And Tom?
Yeah, my name's Tom Young, and I'm a volunteer at the Recovery Cafe, and it came about at a good time for me. A lot of different problems with addiction in my family. And anyway, I'm happy to be here and happy to be part of the group, and look forward to us all being around each other in person. Thanks.
Thanks, Tom. Annie.
Hello, my name is Annie Lovato, and I am a recovery advocate with Recovery Cafe. And I am also in recovery myself, 15 years. And I am a big believer in community. I think it really helps healing in all areas. And so, yeah, that's why I'm here and looking forward to the training.
Awesome, thanks. So I'm going to list the next three people. So we'll do Bruce, Janice, Rhea.
Well, hi, everybody. I'm Bruce, and I am a volunteer. I'm also Brian's father-in-law.
Oh.
And I live in Seattle right now, and within weeks I'm going to be moving to Whidbey Island.
Wow.
And I've been volunteering at the Recovery Cafe here in Seattle for some time, and I'm going to be moving that to Recovery Cafe Jefferson County when we move. I also have I built the website for, that Brian referred to. I've also done other graphic design and techie stuff, but I look forward to being more involved in person. Also, I am in recovery, 44 years clean and sober.
Wow.
How can you be
Bit of time.
Thanks, Bruce. Janice, and then Rhea.
I am Janice. I'm a volunteer here with Recovery Cafe, and training to be a recovery coach is my intent. So all of these training classes, I've been taking them to learn more about the whole thing, the whole picture of it. I myself have been in recovery or been addicted to something my whole lifetime. So it's been an in and out for me. So this is a really, really, identify with this recovery program more than any of the other ones I've ever touched before. So I'm really excited about it to be a help, and for myself also personally. So it's good to be here. Thank you.
Thanks, Janice. And Rhea.
Yes, Rhea Stika, and volunteer, and just walking the steps as it seems appropriate. And I've been a therapist through the years with those who are caring for loved ones who are chronically ill. So that's my background. I have addiction in my family, and I'm looking forward to this morning.
Thank you, Rhea. So we're just doing introductions for those who are joining us right now. We're just giving our name and what brings us to the training. We're going to keep it to like 60 seconds. So the next 3 people will be Doug, Maura, and Celia.
Hi, Doug Edelstein. I'm a retired school teacher from Seattle, out in Port Townsend for 2 years now. And I'm hoping to be of service in this great effort. The Recovery Cafe, I owe my life in many ways to the recovery community.
Thanks, Doug. And Maura? You might have lost Maura. We'll go to Celia.
Can you hear me? Hi, my name is Celia Walden, and I'm a volunteer with the Recovery, or finding out how to volunteer with the Recovery Cafe. Have had a lot of addiction in my family for multiple generations, and been around it a lot. And I'm looking forward to this, to find a more constructive way to help and engage with those who are in recovery and those who are struggling with addiction.
Thank you, Celia. Glad you're here. So we'll do Caitlin, Suzanne, and John.
Okay. My name is Caitlin. I'm totally new to Dove House and Recovery Cafe, so I'm looking to be in the community more, and really I'm just here to listen and learn and support as I can and see where I can fit in and help. So that's why I'm here.
Thanks, Caitlin. Good to meet you.
Thanks.
Okay. I'm sorry. Everyone's kind of moving around. What was it? I said Caitlin and then Suzanne. Did I lose her? Okay, let's go, John.
Caught me off guard there. John Hamilton, I'm volunteer for Dove House. My wife is also on the board. I'm a Vietnam veteran, combat veteran from there. And that's why I signed up to see if I could help with veterans issues and whatnot. My interruption earlier, you saw me, I was on my phone. It was the good old VA, my nemesis for getting benefits, constantly calling at the worst times. But as far as addiction goes, my family's had quite a bit of addiction in it. So I've grown up around it. I've also helped some friends get into treatment in the past during my work life. So I have been involved on an ongoing basis with a number of addiction issues with interpersonal people and family.
Thank you, John. So can we do Jan, Kat, and then Denise?
Are you talking?
Yes, you.
I'm Jan Hobart, and I'm a retired teacher in the local area, the PI program, and I grew up in an alcoholic home, and we struggled with my daughter, who was struggling with addiction from early teen to late teen years. And Angel, I just want to say that you were one of the angels in our lives at that point. You were one of the very first people that stepped in and helped save our lives. So I'm so thankful that you're here today. And I'm thankful
Nice to
that
see
I'm
you again.
Yeah, nice to see you too.
Thanks, Jan. And Kat?
Hi, everybody. I'm glad to be here. I'm Kat, and I'm a volunteer, and I've been on the advisory board, and I'm a veteran too, John, as you know, and I have 26 years of clean sober from alcohol, and I don't know, I'm just really excited to be here and see your faces. But I'm gonna mute off because I got some work to do, so thank you.
Thanks, Kat. And Denise?
Hi, I'm Denise. I work at Jefferson County Public Health. I'm a Community Prevention and Wellness Initiative Coordinator and have a alcohol and drug prevention advocacy organization called the Empowered Teens Coalition that I work through in the county. And I'm here because I want to learn more about how to be a volunteer at Recovery Cafe. And I've been sober since 1985. Thanks.
Thanks, Denise. And we had Maura come back to join us. Maura, go ahead.
Hi, sorry about that. We've got a big windstorm out here on Cape George. I don't know if you guys are experiencing that in town. But yeah, so I'm Maura Walsh, and I've been working with the Recovery Cafe since, I guess, January of 2019. I did my internship. I was getting my counseling psychology degree, and I was getting my internship at the Dove House, and I found out about the Recovery Cafe, and fireworks went off, and I have been just helping out ever since. I'm helping with the aesthetics of making it pretty over there, and I did get my recovery coach certification, and I'm an advisory board member. And I'm just very passionate about support for those that are in recovery, all kinds of recovery. So anyway, I'm really happy to be here. So good to see you all.
Thanks, Maura. And I think we're getting close to wrapping up. We'll have Ben, and then Wayne and Carol. Ben, you on? All right.
Yes, I'm here. Hello, my name is Ben Castard. I'm Air Corps volunteer, assistant to Brian during the course of the Recovery Cafe remodel project, volunteer coordinator, and also fellow man in recovery, a little over 15 months from alcohol. So I'm here because, well, I've done most of the trainings, and I've watched the Recovery Cafe being built as a concept and as a building, and I enjoy the type of work. I'm also a certified recovery coach and outreach worker.
Thanks, Ben. And how about you, Wayne?
Okay. Yeah, hi, I'm Wayne Blyer. I'm recently returned to town after working 26 years overseas in community-based child protection in emergencies, in mostly war and conflict situations with children. And prior to that, I worked at Jefferson County Mental Health as a child and family therapist. And I'm just looking for ways to plug into the community again. And I learned about Recovery House, and I like its community focus and the philosophy behind it. So I'd like to, be a part of it.
Welcome, good to meet you.
Thanks.
And Carol?
I'm just an ordinary citizen, and I'm extremely grateful for the opportunity to be in this training because I haven't had this kind of training, and it's such a cross-cutting issue all over our world. Thank you.
Thank you, Carol. And I have a couple people who have chosen to turn their screens off, so I won't name you, but if you'd like to introduce yourself, I'll give you a moment of silence here and you can speak up. Okay, Well, thank you everyone for doing that. Part of what these trainings are about is to help us build our recovery community. So it's nice, even though we can't be all together in person, for us to get to know each other a little bit, kind of who we are and where we're coming from. And so with that, I think what I'd like to have Angel do is talk a little bit more about the work that you do and what Safe Harbor is, because part of being a volunteer at Recovery Cafe is knowing what are the resources in our community for folks who are coming to us who might need more support.
Sure. So again, like I was saying, I've been at Safe Harbor, which is an outpatient treatment center, well, about 15 years. Anyway, it's an outpatient treatment center, and what we do is the process kind of starts with a referral. Sometimes it's a self-referral, but oftentimes it's from the legal system. We work with the drug court and the behavioral health court, family therapeutic court. We have CPS referrals, school referrals, and of course family. And so what we do is an intake just to get started, and then an assessment. And the assessment will make the diagnosis, you know, is it a substance use disorder? How severe is it? And from there be able to determine what kind of care is needed, what level of care. We provide here intensive outpatient, which is typically 3 days a week. You know, we can always talk more about that if you want to, but that's the intensive. And then we also do outpatient once a week, twice a week, all the way to like what we call monthly continuing care, where people kind of just do follow-up stuff once a month for a period of time. And then we also do referrals. We work on getting people into detox or what they call withdrawal management now. Obviously just, you know, coming off of the substances, of physiological dependency part of it, right? And there's acute detox and subacute. Sometimes there's a need for medical and sometimes it's more social. And then we also make referrals for residential treatment, and that can vary anywhere from a matter of weeks to all the way to 9 months to a year, depending on what the individual's needs are. And so like I said, here though, the treatment we do is primarily outpatient or connecting them to other, you know, programs that they might be needing. Like I said, I've been doing this for a long time here. I've worked in social services. I can't believe how the time's just going by for like 20 years or so, I guess it's been now. I started out working with youth. Actually, I started out working with children 6 months to 6 years old that were from abused and neglected homes. And across the board, we've seen the vast majority came from homes with addiction. And then I went on to work with adolescents, primarily girls in a group home setting that were all dependents of the state. They'd been removed from their homes and were, you know, parental rights had been terminated, things like that. And again, it was the same thing. I saw that addiction pretty much across the board, you know, not always, but almost always. They came from homes where people were active in their addiction, and, you know, there was a lot of abuse and neglect and things like that. And some of the girls themselves were beginning to struggle there. And so because of that, I had my bachelor's in psychology at that point. And because of that, I went on to study addiction and earned my, at the time it was a chemical dependency professional, and now it's a substance use disorder professional license, and began doing this. And, but I still felt there needed to be more though, because there's such a, you know, a link. And I think you guys all see that with mental health issues as well. So that's actually what brought me back to Port Townsend. There was a master's program at the time here for counseling psychology. So that's what I did. And I also did my internship at Dove House for that. Finished it up with DBH with Bernie, which was really great. And I've just been happy here at Safe Harbor. So I've stuck here and I'm doing the co-occurring treatment. I started out doing the youth treatment here, but so that's what I do. And that's what Safe Harbor does, is a lot of just figuring out what's going on for people and what kind of services they need. So that's that. So any questions about Safe Harbor or that process?
Go ahead, Jan.
Do you still do the family groups?
Yeah, we haven't been lately, but that's such a, you know, that was such a good thing. We've offered kind of an evening group that was just open and it was free. And I would love to see that get started again. And maybe that's even something we could work with Recovery Cafe on having. Yeah, I hadn't even thought about that, but that was kind of for the loved ones of people struggling with addiction. Some of their people, their children or their partners or, you know, whoever might have been involved with Safe Harbor, but some weren't even involved in treatment. They were still just actively using or whatever was going on. So no, we haven't had that group going for a little while. We just haven't had the numbers, but I think it's a great group and something that would be important. And again, it might even be able to connect with Recovery Cafe in that way.
That's a great idea.
Yeah.
Really important to us.
Yeah.
Are there any other questions? Yeah, for Angel about what she does or what is Safe Harbor? Okay. Something I want to get to later is, what does treatment look like during the pandemic? That's just a primer. But what I want to talk about first is the topic for today's training. So we have labeled it Addiction 101. So it's intended to be for folks who maybe don't know anything about addiction. I know most of you know some things about addiction, but I want to start with like a base level. So we assume, you know, we don't know anything. That's kind of where we'll start from. So Angel, I know that's really broad and I know we talked about it a little bit beforehand, but yeah, if you wouldn't mind kind of getting started.
Absolutely.
And any of us, we all have expertise in this area. So some of us can maybe jump in and help fill in gaps.
Oh, that's great. I like that. Yeah, I noticed there was a lot of variety here from healthcare workers and social service workers, teachers, all the way to the, I think, would you call yourself an average citizen, you know, and I'm sure you have a lot of knowledge too. But I thought one of the first questions is just to ask, and you guys are pretty informed, but when you think of addiction or an addict, what do you think of? And not just even what you think of now, given your kind of experiences and knowledge, but even what you thought growing up or what other people have taught you, you know, that kind of a thing. So what do you think when you think of addiction and addicts?
I lived on Portland's Skid Row for 11 years. So a lot of my neighbors had addiction and substance abuse issues. But what really opened my mind was working with the mayor's office on other issues, public restrooms, and just finding out how many people were in recovery among the top civil servants in Portland, and just how universal. And but I never had an opportunity to get training like this.
Yeah.
Is it okay if we just chime in?
I would be happy if you did, yeah.
Okay, all right. So when I think about addictions and folks who are suffering addictions, a couple of things come to mind, and it's, you know, can be all the way from, you know, something that you can't see in the person to something that's incredibly obvious. But for me, in my own personal struggle, the characteristic that really helped me understand that this was an addiction was that I planned all my stuff around being able to have alcohol. Mm-hmm. So it was like when I cut it down to just drinking on Friday nights, it was I planned all week long for drinking on Friday night. And also knew that on Saturday and Sunday, I would be suffering from the recovery from the drinking on Friday night. And then it's the, once you start, you cannot stop. Even if it's making you sick, you can't stop doing it. And so then comes all the things that cause social problems within your interpersonal relationships and your broader social relationships and status. And so when people start to talk to me about things like that, you know, like having trouble in social life, having trouble with social status, et cetera, and so on, that always sort of makes me wonder, well, how much are you drinking? Or how much are you using pot, or whatever your drug of choice is. So, and then of course that goes all the way down the spectrum to, you know, the person who is stumbling around, or the tweaker who's heading down the sidewalk with all the passion in the world, you know, that kind of thing. So, yeah. Thank you.
My take on this is that I don't really know very much about the kind of addictions that you're talking about. I grew up in a very liberal bunch of hippies, and everybody was, the door was open. And when I got married and left that and came into the bigger world, I just started to, and then got into healthcare. What I learned was the addiction, there's a couple of addictions that people are basically, as I see this, unconscious about. One is the way that they think in crisis, and the way that they manage politics, social stuff. There's people have a certain way of thinking that they become addicted to that way. And the other thing is a kind of an unconscious. I think that it's extremely important for people to start getting back to the organic and get away from all the chemicals that are in the natural, the regular food that people eat, whether it's fast food or dry, all that stuff, that the cheap stuff. It influences how we think and how we feel in our bodies. And that's what I'm an environmentalist, a gardener, and a healthcare worker. I've seen so much people, so many patients of all sorts and their families be addicted to a certain food and a certain way of thinking. And that's what I always want to address. So it's great to be here. Thank you.
Yeah.
Thanks, Susanna. Rhea, you had your hand up.
Yeah, for me, the main piece in our family was how the lying and the untruth, we could never then like trust. And that was very painful because we loved the person and we wanted to believe that they were being truthful with us. And so that's the piece especially that is the hardest for me when I think back at that time.
Yep.
Thanks, Rhea. And we'll go with one more and then, so John, and then we'll kick it back to Angel.
All right. Yeah, well, in my experience, it was a lot like Rhea said, there was no trust. There was always manipulation with lies going on. Control was a big issue from the alcoholic, controlling everybody's life, and things of that nature. And when I think of addiction, you think of either alcoholism or drug use mostly, and those are the ones that I've been focused on in my life. And in my work life, when I was a union rep, I was also part of the employee assistance program. That's how I ended up helping a few people who had alcoholic problems. Protecting their job was my job, and in part, and by doing that, getting them to an employee assistance program was what was helpful. But yeah, the lying and the cheating and whatever they could do, stealing money, whatever they could do to get the money, to get their drug of choice, stay drunk, stay high, was what I was confronted with. Thank you.
Thanks, John. So
Yeah.
I'm sorry. I do want to come back to it. I want to kind of get us grounded a little bit first, because I'm hearing people's personal experiences, which is part of what we wanted to hear today. And I'm hearing kind of like a you know it when you see it sort of thing. And we are talking about certain behaviors, and I'm hearing some labels being thrown out. So I do want to address stigma at some point. But Angel,
Yes.
Can you kind of ground us in like, what are we?
That's actually exactly where I was kind of going with this. I think overall you guys are pretty well informed. I mean, one of the first things I heard about was, working in, I can't remember where, but seeing that there were so many people in recovery that you would never even have thought that, that struggled with addiction. And that's a big part of the truth. And, as time goes on, we start to get to kind of some of the ugly stuff, the lying and the cheating and the stealing. And then that's where we start to get to stigma, and again, you guys seem to be pretty well informed that there's a whole lot more, to this, right? And that's great. But we have this stigma and stereotypes about addiction and addicts, right? I heard Skid Row said, and that's a lot of times, and not in an inappropriate way, just in reference to, right? But that's what we hear, like in Skid Row, the bum sleeping under the bench with the bottle of, Mad Dog or whatever it is, homeless and their teeth are out and their skin is all bad. And so we start to have these stigmas, they're criminals and that kind of stuff, and the stereotypes. And we're going to talk a little bit more about it later on, but that's the kind of stuff that goes on, and if you think about it, again, you're pretty informed people that are volunteering in this. And so that's good, but there could be a lot of people that have other thoughts about what addiction looks like and what addicts looks like, and it can be pretty negative. And so when we have those stereotypes and stigma, as Brian brought up, that's a big part of what can keep people sick. And we're going to talk about that in a little bit. So, but the next piece I wanted to ask, and we can kind of keep it moving at a quick pace, I'm sure, but just in general, you know, and maybe we'll do a hand raise thing. I was going to kind of ask, but we can kind of do it this way. Do you think addiction is a disease? Is addiction a disease? Yeah. I see some hands and I see some nods.
Could you repeat that, please?
Yes, it was just a question of, do you think that addiction is a disease? Is addiction a disease? Yeah. Yeah. So a lot of people are raising their hands and some are unsure, and that's totally fine. What would make you, and maybe we'll just have a few people answer, but what would make you think it is a disease?
Yeah, most people who get there have to have some kind of intervention from help from professionals, whether it be a doctor or, you know, counselors such as yourself who've gone through the appropriate training. All too often, people that are addicted to either drugs, alcohol, whatever, they don't want to admit it. They never want to, I don't have a problem.
Mm-hmm.
They will live in this world of denial for so long that then you have to have some kind of intervention to get them to actually work on their disease. In order to get past it and stuff, they need assistance from real professionals to get through the emotional part of acceptance and things of that nature.
Yeah. So some kind of intervention has to happen. Somebody has to kind of step in maybe sometimes and help see this. I'm sorry, I don't remember the name. I see Olympic Region, YM, raising her hand.
Oh, okay.
Oops, you just got muted.
So I'm unmuted now. Okay. So I'm Denise, and sorry, my name says Olympic Region. I'm using someone else's account.
That's okay.
Addiction is a disease because whatever substance that you're using, it changes your brain chemistry. And so you don't have a choice because your brain chemistry has actually been altered and
Sure.
is telling you that you have to have this substance. Yeah.
Okay, yeah. And then just, I see that there was a chat question about infectious, and so we'll talk about that in a minute. And just to get the flip side, if somebody's not sure that it's a disease or doesn't think that maybe it is, and that's okay, what makes, or in general, what would make the general population perhaps think addiction's not a disease? What's kind of the argument against that? So Annie.
Yeah, well, oftentimes what I have heard is people believe that it's a full choice, that people are actually choosing that, and they could, just like that, choose not to do it.
Yeah.
And I don't think that that's the case.
Yeah. That is the biggest argument against the disease. I'll just kind of jump into that, is that choice idea of it, that a person is choosing to use, which, yes, there is a choice involved. However, we're going to talk about the disease and why that doesn't really fit and how the disease model does fit. I'm just kind of reading the other stuff.
Yeah.
Too.
Bruce,
Okay.
you're going to say something?
Yeah.
Yes.
Well, I guess I mean, what Annie said was part of what I was going to say, but I also, I mean, I've been around the disease model a long time, and excuse me, in some ways, I don't think it is accurate enough. I mean, I think by moving to like the terminology of substance use disorder is really a better model.
Sure.
And that this is more fundamental. Disease implies a lot of things that really I don't think apply to addiction, but it's really, you know, that switch that flipped in my brain.
No, that's great, and that's perfect.
Know,
so that actually leads kind of to the next question of what is a disease?
So I might help out a little bit here, Angel. the way that I understand the disease model, generally speaking, like the medical model, right, is that we have some kind of organ and there is a defect to that organ and we have symptoms that result from that. So in the case of addiction, the argument for the disease model goes that the organ involved is the brain, and the specific part of the brain is the pleasure and reward system in our brains. So the defect being a defect in the way that the person experiences pleasure, essentially. And the symptoms being some of the things that you guys talked about, an inability to control once use begins, and an inability to stop despite the negative consequences to relationships or physical health, employment, things like that.
Yep. Yeah, so I'll just kind of jump right into what I was going to talk about with that, because that's exactly it for us. And I completely appreciate where Bruce is coming from. You know, some of the stuff that can be confusing is a lot of times, not all, but oftentimes with a disease, we can do a blood test or a scan or something. We can see it. It's very, you know, more tangible kind of a thing sometimes for people. And I get the choice idea, because a person is choosing to pick up and drink, right? There's a choice there. But what we're looking at is the disease. And sometimes people break it down to dis-ease, you know, basically meaning there's something wrong. Something's not working right in the body. The disease model, or causal model sometimes it's called, is very much like what Brian was talking about. There's an organ that's been impacted some way. There's a defect or damage to it. It's not quite working properly. And one of the examples, you know, that we often use in addiction and recovery is diabetes, because there's a lot of good parallels. I mean, they're completely different, but there's some good parallels there. So of course we know that with diabetes, the organ is the pancreas, right? We know it doesn't properly produce insulin. You know, the blood sugar is poorly regulated. So that's the problem there. And the symptoms we know can be fatigue or blurred vision, poor circulation, thirst. You know, there's a variety of symptoms that go along with that. And if it's left untreated, you know, no interventions happening, we know that people can die from this. We know that for years and years, people did die from it. We've come a long ways with being able to identify it and treat it. So a disease tends to be chronic. It tends to be long-term. It's progressive, and it'll get worse if it goes untreated. It's also pervasive in that it affects numerous areas of a person's life and often potentially fatal. And so I usually do very interactive type of stuff, but I won't always put it out there as a question since we have to keep moving. So normally I would do kind of a discussion on how does addiction fit that model, but I'll just kind of jump into it. And then if people have comments or questions, we could do that. So how does addiction fit the model? Well, the organ is the brain, right? That's where addiction's taking place. I have heard people be a little confused or have the thought perhaps that it's the liver, you know, because the liver is being used to process it. That would really be more of the symptom still. The disease is actually taking place in the brain. And specifically, like Brian talked about, it has to do with the pleasure centers of the brain, the nucleus accumbens or whatever, but we don't need to do all that. There's a great movie, actually. It's a little slow, but it's very good, and I can always mention it at the end again, too. Pleasure Unwoven. It describes the disease in the brain really well. So anyway, though, when we experience something pleasurable, whether, you know, people talked about food and things like that, that stuff creates pleasure rewards too. You know, the dopamine surges. And what happens with anything that we could become addicted to, because people are absolutely right, it's not just drugs and alcohol, you know, gambling and sex and food, anything that kind of creates that pleasurable response, we can have an addiction with. So there's that release of dopamine, those surges, and they're very powerful. And so then the day-to-day normal kind of routine life stuff doesn't produce that anymore. But we want that. We want to feel really good. And so like Brian was talking about, it has to do with pleasure and motivation and reward. If it's pleasurable, we're going to keep doing that because we want to experience that. Looking at my notes here, kind of the same stuff. I talked about the brain being the defect. And so ultimately, you know, and in one of the videos I watched, I thought this was so smart. They said it is a disease of choice. Because a person's not choosing, obviously, to have addiction, just as a person doesn't choose to have any other diseases or illnesses or whatever, but it becomes a disease of choice where they can no longer make that choice. They don't choose to have the cravings. In that, I wasn't going to necessarily do this, but I think there's a great, in that Pleasure Unwoven video, he does a really good example of, he shows kind of, he has this whole Western theme going, so, but whatever. So the guy's in the bar and there's a shot of whiskey there. And they tell him he can have it, something along those lines. But then somebody else, you know, they point a gun at him. And if he takes that drink, they're going to shoot him in the head, right? And he says, clearly that must be choice because the person can choose not to drink at that point. But what then he talks about is the person doesn't choose, they still want it. It didn't go away just because the gun was pointed at their head. And they might even have thoughts like he talks about, you know, can I get the alcohol into my body, into my brain before the bullet comes crashing in? Would he really shoot me? Is the gun even loaded? Right? That's where we talk about the choice. Yes, when we're forced with intense, immediate consequences, perhaps a person can make that choice, but it's a disease of choice in that they still will want that. You know, it's not like, oh, well, never mind, you know, and no thought given to it. It's still very strong there. So in that sense, that's how we fit it to the disease model. Because again, the disease, like Brian was saying, it looks at an organ, a defect, and the symptoms. And we have all of those there. And then in the video, he does a great job of talking about, we don't, and this is a little bit of a later topic, but we don't want to treat just the symptoms. We need to go and treat the problem. And I was going to talk a little bit about historically, that's the problem. Historically, with all diseases, diabetes included, the symptoms were being treated. And so that's kind of what the first question was about, some of those symptoms, you know, the lying, the cheating, the stealing, the manipulation, you know, even homelessness and poor health and dental and all those kind of stuff might be some of the symptoms that are easily identified, right? So we might want to just put them into housing or get them a job or, you know, do these various things. But that's just treating the symptoms. It's a very important part of it. I mean, absolutely, people they need to have housing. You can not have high success rates if they don't have housing. They're going to need their medical care needs taken care of and all of that kind of stuff. But just doing those things alone is not going to actually treat the problem. But let's talk a little bit. We'll talk about that again in a little bit. Some of the symptoms, again, I'll just kind of keep going with it. Well, first of all, did anybody have any questions about that or comments?
Can I jump in just to say, to kind of to Bruce's point and to sort of address the like stigma stuff as well. I'm not here to convince anybody necessarily of the disease model, but I do want to just say, historically speaking, what role that has played in the lives of people who experience substance use disorder or addiction or whatever you'd like to call it. In the past, as Denise put in the chat there, we thought of it as a moral failing, a character defect, something wrong with the individual. And that has a lot of baggage to it. We then see the person as having done something wrong, or yeah, we will blame that person for the condition that they have, right? What the disease model did was it said, hey, actually, this is a condition that the person did not choose and that maybe we can treat, actually. So it changed it from shame on you, there's something wrong with you, to hey, let's help this person out. Something I guess I would speak to too with what Bruce is talking about. I think the disease model is a helpful description of the experience that someone might be having. It's helpful to have a set of symptoms, you know, and it also helps people access services that they might need. With diagnoses come funding through insurance and hospital care and things like that. I think it's a really complex thing, and that's why there's even like a debate about it, right? There's the case to be made for what role does the environment play in a person's addiction. What someone who is a proponent of the disease model might say is that we have a predisposition to, or a susceptibility to having a substance use disorder, and something in the environment flips that switch. Something in the environment turns it on. There's a physician named Dr. Gabor Mate who wrote a book about the concept that the environment affects how does this play out for a person. He talks a lot about childhood trauma, and we see that connection, right? I think some of you guys are probably familiar with the Adverse Childhood Experiences study, which essentially looked at children who had experienced things like a death in the family at a young age. Maybe they witnessed domestic violence. Maybe their own parent had a substance use disorder or a mental illness that affected their ability to care for them as children. And then they looked at the correlation between that and other long-term life outcomes. And what they found was that it was highly correlated with increased mental health symptoms, increased substance use disorder, but also other physical health things like obesity and diabetes. And so I just want to put that out there to say that, again, that we're not trying to convince you guys of anything, but trying to create this like framework within which we can have empathy for people who experience this, and like for sure move past that moral model.
Yeah. Yeah, that kind of goes into that next thing, like why is it important to see it as a disease? And in one sense it's not, right? I mean, it just is what it is and we need to address it, but it's very much like you talked about, you know, for the medical and things like that to become available to people. Labels in general, you know, can be hard. I mean, on the mental health labels, depression, anxiety, bipolar disorder. In one sense, labels can be hard because we can just give into it and that's what it is. But in the other sense, that kind of stuff is important because then we know what it is and then we know how to address it. So yeah, some of the important things about seeing it as a disease or at least a medical issue of some kind that needs to be treated and not the moral failing is it becomes treatable at that point, right? If it's not just a bad person, we can treat it. Oh, there's something going on here with signs and symptoms and we can treat that. And that starts to erode the stigma away, you know? I didn't think of an example, but I'm sure there's even medical issues, you know, that have had stigmas around them that hopefully have started to minimize, you know, because we see like, oh, this isn't, you know, this is what's going on for this person. This isn't about them just being bad. And like Brian said, it becomes a diagnosis and then it can, you know, insurance companies can cover the costs of treatment and things like that. One thing to know though, there's no, at least so far in our beliefs, there's no effective, there's no cure, but there is very effective treatment. And treatment, again, like I was saying earlier, it's not about treating the symptoms. It's about, you know, getting that person the house and that kind of stuff. It really is about starting to treat those underlying issues of dealing with stress. I was going to talk a little bit about the symptoms. And you guys, when we talked earlier, we did identify some. There are some very specific symptoms when we are doing an assessment and a diagnosis. So I thought I would just go over those. And some people were already covering those pretty well, but just to kind of lay them out, it's the DSM-5. You know, one of them is the substance is often taken in larger amounts over a longer period of time than we plan on, right? The person was just going to have a beer or a glass of wine, and then they drank the whole bottle, you know, or whatever it happens to be. They were only going to go out for an hour, and then they end up staying till closing. You know, things like that become sort of a pattern. Oftentimes, there's a persistent desire to control it, or to minimize the use. They want to stop, but they just struggle. Like, I'll only drink on Thursdays or Fridays or whatever it happens to be. And they try to control it in that way. I'll stick to only beer, you know, that kind of a thing, or whatever it is. And they break their own rules with that. People mention this, that they spend a lot of time either getting it, you know, seeking it out, planning for that Friday drinking, whatever it happens to be, actually using the substance, again, whatever that happens to be, and then of course recovering from the effects, you know, hangovers or beyond, even that kind of thing. A big one, and this was only actually, I think, added to the DSM-5, I think it was under consideration before that, is craving. Craving is a huge marker of addiction, of the disease or the substance use disorders, is having that strong desire to use. And in the movie they talk about this, and it's so true. It's not just like, I really want some ice cream right now. It's like this really on this cellular level of needing it. Because again, we talked about how it kind of hijacks that pleasure center and reward part of the brain that has to then do a choice. And so it becomes more about a survival. And again, that's different at different levels. You know, a mild use disorder versus a severe use disorder, that could look different. But anyway, the cravings are intense. It's not as simple as I would really like some ice cream right now. Although for some people, food is an addiction in itself, and that craving could be just as strong. Another big one is there's continued use despite negative consequences. We see that a lot, right? People get a DUI and they're in trouble and they continue drinking, or maybe they have a health issue. Several years ago, I had to do an assessment for somebody. This is another referral source sometimes, is medical. The person needed a liver transplant and was a chronic long-term alcohol user, but he was convinced the alcohol had nothing to do with it and he wasn't going to stop regardless. And that touches on denial, which we'll talk about a little bit later. But so that continued use, despite having, you know, again, consequences or medical issues, things like that. We know that oftentimes important social, work, recreational activities are given up. You know, people are, again, planning for that drinking on Friday and, you know, don't have the energy or the desire or motivation to go out and do anything else. You know, people stop hanging out with some of their friends for various reasons. Sometimes they just lose interest, and sometimes the friends are so concerned about their use, they don't want to be around that. Using when it's physically dangerous, you know, like driving a car, operating machinery, things like that. A big one, of course, that most people know about is tolerance, right? There's an increase in tolerance. And that's not to say that everybody that has a bit of an increase in tolerance to something has addiction. Again, no one of these is enough. It takes, I think it's 2 to 3 at a minimum just for a mild use disorder, which is what used to be called abuse. And more than that, you know, there's 11 criteria here. So tolerance, though, is an increase, and it kind of continues to rise. And it can be a very dangerous sort of a process. So it's not just that like, ooh, this person can handle 2 or 3 beers. It elevates more and more. And then the withdrawal, which again, people have heard, and know about withdrawal. This is where the person, when they don't have this substance, might become ill. And again, that can vary from just a little bit, and like a headache and not feeling well, pretty mild stuff, to really severe. Like alcohol withdrawal, for example, is one of the most severe. People actually can die of alcohol withdrawal. And that's where I talked about needing the withdrawal management, which can be the acute, where maybe they're just feeling sick, nauseous, maybe a little medication can help them through it, all the way to the more acute, where they might need to go into the hospital. They might be having the DTs, seizures, things like that. Oftentimes, just as a note, withdrawal symptoms from a substance are oftentimes the opposite of the effect, right? So if the effect makes you, sleepy, and then when you're coming off of it, there might be trouble with sleep. Marijuana, for example, some people think that there's not even really the tolerance to withdrawal. That doesn't matter. Oftentimes the withdrawal from marijuana is just the things that it caused, like appetite increase. So now we have a decrease in appetite. There might be some irritability, things like that. So that's just kind of something interesting to watch for, that it's the opposite. Yep, benzo withdrawal can also cause potential death. Yeah, benzos are very much, there was that in the chat there, benzodiazepines are very much kind of a pill form of alcohol. They're very similar. And that's why actually benzodiazepines are often used in the treatment of alcohol withdrawal. So they get the person on that, and then they can take things, taper them down so that it's, not going to kill them. Historically, they even would use alcohol. So those are the symptoms. And again, that's why it's important to see it. And we're not treating each one of those symptoms. If we were just treating tolerance and withdrawal, that'd be the physiological, but that wouldn't deal with any of the other psychological components, of dealing with stress and things like that. Historically, we've already mentioned that it was really seen as this morals and values issue, right? That people had some kind of failing, they had bad behavior, weakness, lack of willpower. I say historical, unfortunately, there are still people that might have that opinion, but there's a lot of change happening there. People were put into asylums, they were tied to beds, there were lobotomies, that was the former form of treatment for alcoholism, electric shock therapy, and of course incarceration. And again, that touches on why we look at it in this sort of causal model, so we can see what's going on, so it becomes treatable, and then we're not just, people do still go to jail for it, and that can be part of the process, but it's not just about that. It's not just about the punishment or treating the symptoms, about treating the underlying problems, that sort of thing. And one more thing on this. Go ahead.
Oh,
yeah.
Oh, I was going to put it back out to the group. So finish your thought, and then I
Oh,
want
no, go ahead. That's a good spot too.
Oh, okay. Yeah, I guess I just wanted to hear, because we've shared a lot of information, and I want to know, where's this landing for people, or what questions do people still have? Go ahead, Rhea.
One of the things that I dealt with was, because it was a disease, I should be able to stay in the relationship. And I could not stay in the relationship. And so there was some guilt that I was not sticking it out because it was a disease. And I didn't know a whole lot at that time in my life. But I do remember a real feeling of my own feelings about myself, because I couldn't stay in it when it was a disease.
Yeah, I'm assuming you're referring to like a partner struggling with it.
Yeah, that was one person in my life. I
Yeah.
could go away with a father figure, but when it was really in the relationship, that was and children.
Yeah. No, that makes so much sense. And I think that with anything, there is probably that flip side of it, like, well, geez, would I leave this person if they had cancer? Gee, I wouldn't do that. But there are definitely some differences, and that's, kind of jumping ahead a little bit, but that's where sometimes like Al-Anon can be really important, and the counseling can be really important. And while it's not a choice to have the addiction, there is a level of choice involved as far as like, am I going to accept treatment? Am I going to work on making changes? What's happening here? It's very, very complicated, and it is a family disease, and that's a really historically, in relationships, women would be put in the asylums because men didn't stay with women, back in the day if they were crazy and needed all that, whereas women would do a lot of kind of the codependency and taking care of and things like that. And it's obviously it's changed over the years, but that's kind of historically. But that is a big one. There's a movie, and it's a really good movie called When Love's Not Enough. And I mean, I'm glad Lois Wilson stuck with Bill Wilson because great things came of it. But I got to be honest, sometimes when I watch that movie, I think, what is she thinking? What is she doing, to herself throughout that process? But that's really hard. And that's where definitely things like Al-Anon and counseling can come really into play, some codependency work and stuff like that. That's a really hard one. Yeah, really good point.
Angel, we have about 30 minutes left.
Yeah.
As I was thinking about, what to do with this training today, I thought if we have enough time, there's a video that I wanted to show folks. It's a TED Talk that's about 14 minutes long. Do you think it's worth showing that?
I think it probably could be. What I'll do is kind of wrap up a few points I thought were important, and I think we might be able to, and we'll see where people are at. Yeah. So
Great.
A few things I wanted to talk about, just because oftentimes it's a question as to why, what's the cause, why is this happening to me or my husband or my child or whoever it happens to be, why them? And so we've already touched on it. I know somebody put it over in the chats about the genetic, I like to call it like a genetic vulnerability, just like anything else, if it's in our family, we have a vulnerability to it. We're just more likely to develop it than if we didn't have that vulnerability. Same with diabetes, same with some of the cancers and things like that. There's just a vulnerability. And then as people mentioned, trauma. Trauma often is a big part of mental health issues and addiction issues. It's really all mental health, isn't it? So trauma, serious challenges in life, like Brian brought up ACEs. That's a really good kind of measure, one of the things. And then early exposure to it, kind of a thing, which is true with a lot of things. If you have this early exposure and these vulnerabilities to it, it can develop into a problem. We don't have good answers as to why this person actually develops it and this person doesn't. Same with some of the mental illness. Like there's no good answer to that, but we can see that there's definitely genetic vulnerabilities and early childhood trauma. There's statistics, I think it's 70-some% of women with addiction issues have experienced sexual abuse, and 60-some% of men have. And we know that those numbers are low because this is not something people over-report, it's something that they under-report. So trauma definitely plays a role. And so then we know it becomes about stress and coping, right? So those are things that get addressed in treatment. So given all this, again, I kind of wanted to make sure we understood why people don't seek out help more. When I went to school for, psychology and then the master's in counseling, people want to get better, people want help. And some people do, and I think ultimately most people do, but it can be really hard. And it's what we talked about before, that stigma, that shame, and then of course denial. And then denial, we don't have to spend a lot of time on it because it seems like you guys do have an understanding of that. But the one thing to know, oftentimes when we're talking about denial, it's not just simply lying. There is that definitely is a piece of it. But when we're talking about denial of the disease or of addiction itself, people don't see it. It's not that they're trying to lie or be dishonest about it. They just don't see it. Sometimes it's because of that stigma stuff, right? Well, I'm not living on, Skid Row under a bench drinking Mad Dog or whatever it is. I have a job. I have a house. So it can't be me. Or I'm not using needles, or whatever it is. There's all kinds of ways to deny it. And again, it's not at that stage anyways, kind of what we call the pre-contemplation stage of change. It's not about lying. It really is about just not being able to see it. And if we don't see it, why would we seek treatment for it? Let's see, the people are, they're hurt and they're lost and they don't know what to do, that kind of stuff. And it is a family disease, much kind of what Rhea, I think, was bringing up and touching on. And so that's kind of the stuff that we go over in treatment, is learning about that kind of stuff. And so I think I'll kind of slow down, and I think watch the video would be good. Other stuff I have that if you have questions about it, just talking about the stages of change, talking about the different kind of treatment. At Safe Harbor, we do a lot of cognitive behavioral and really want to incorporate sober support. I heard you guys talk earlier about community, and it's absolutely true. What we see, if there's not, a person can do treatment and do great in treatment, but if they don't have that sober support outside of it, oftentimes they're not going to be very successful in the long term. And then if people had questions about like aversion therapy or medically assisted treatment, things like that, that can be, well, medically assisted treatment can be helpful. I don't know that I would say aversion therapy is very helpful, but it's out there and it works for some people, and then DBT and ACT, things like that have been used, and more of the treatment. But so that's addiction in a nutshell. if there's any questions on any of that, or then we'll watch the video.
That is a lot of stuff to cover. Thank you, Angel, for doing that so succinctly. And so this video that I hope the technology and everything will work okay. I'm going to put it in the chat. It's a TED Talk. TED Talks are a series of videos that people share about, I don't know, interesting topics, I guess. So there's a writer named Johan Hari who made a video. I'll be honest with you, the title is a bit dubious. It's called Everything You Know About Addiction is Wrong. He brings up some interesting points. I think some of the things that we've already discussed today. And the last thing that Angel, one of the last things that she was just talking about was this idea of community and connection with the world around us and other important things in our lives that we want to be present for. So this is a theme for his talk here. So I'm going to put the link in the chat. I'm going to get it started. If it's not going to play or whatever, I'll just go ahead and quit and we'll do our best to summarize it. So I'm going to do share screen and we'll watch that now. Video here. Okay.
One of my earliest memories is of trying to wake up one of my relatives and not being able to. And I was just a little kid, so I didn't really understand why. But as I got older, I realized we had drug addiction in my family, including later cocaine addiction. I've been thinking about it a lot lately, partly because it's now exactly 100 years since drugs were first banned in the United States and Britain, and we then imposed that on the rest of the world. It's a century since we made this really fateful decision to take addicts and punish them and make them suffer because we believed that would deter them, it would give them an incentive to stop. And a few years ago, I was looking at some of the addicts in my life who I love and trying to figure out if there was some way to help them. And I realized there were loads of incredibly basic questions I just didn't know the answer to. Like, what really causes addiction? Why do we carry on with this approach that doesn't seem to be working? And is there a better way out there that we could try instead? So I read loads of stuff about it, and I couldn't really find the answers I was looking for. So I thought, okay, I'll go and sit with different people around the world who've lived this and studied this and talk to them and see if I can learn from them. And I didn't realize I would end up going over 30,000 miles at the start, but I ended up going and meeting loads of different people, from a transgender crack dealer in Brownsville, Brooklyn, to a scientist who spends a lot of time feeding hallucinogens to mongooses to see if they like them. It turns out they do, but only in very specific circumstances. To the only country that's ever decriminalized all drugs, from cannabis to crack, Portugal. And the thing I realized that really blew my mind is almost everything we think we know about addiction is wrong. And if we start to absorb the new evidence about addiction, I think we're going to have to change a lot more than our drug policies. But let's start with what we think we know, what I thought I know, right? Let's think about this middle row here, right? Imagine all of you for 20 days now went off and used heroin 3 times a day. Some of you look a little bit more enthusiastic than others at this prospect. Don't worry, it's just a thought experiment. Imagine you did that, right? What would happen? Now, we have a story about what would happen that we've been told for a century. We think because there are chemical hooks in heroin, as you took it for a while, your body would become dependent on those hooks, you'd start to physically need them, and at the end of those 20 days, you'd all be heroin addicts, right? That's what I thought. First thing that alerted me to the fact something not right with this story is when it was explained to me, if I step out of this TED Talk today and I get hit by a car and I break my hip, I'll be taken to hospital and I'll be given loads of diamorphine. Diamorphine is heroin. It's actually much better heroin than you're ever going to buy on the streets, because the stuff you buy from a drug dealer is contaminated, actually very little of it is heroin, whereas the stuff you get from the doctor is medically pure. And you'll be given it for quite a long period of time. There are loads of people in this room who may not realize that you've taken quite a lot of heroin, right? And anyone watching this anywhere in the world, this is happening. And if what we believe about addiction is right, those people are exposed to all those chemical hooks. What should happen? They should become addicts. This has been studied really carefully. It doesn't happen. You will have noticed if your grandmother had a hip replacement, she didn't come out as a junkie. And when I learned this, it just seemed so weird to me, so contrary to everything I'd been told, everything I thought I knew. I just thought it couldn't be right. Until I went and met a man called Bruce Alexander, who's a professor of psychology in Vancouver, who carried out an incredible experiment that I think really helps us to understand this issue. Professor Alexander explained to me, the idea of addiction we've all got in our heads, that story, comes partly from a series of experiments that were done earlier in the 20th century. They're really simple experiments. You can do them tonight when you go home if you feel a little bit sadistic. You get a rat and you put it in a cage and you give it 2 water bottles. One is just water and the other is water laced with either heroin or cocaine. If you do that, the rat will almost always prefer the drugged water and almost always kill itself quite quickly. So there you go, right? That's how we think it works. In the 70s, Professor Alexander comes along and he looks at this experiment and he noticed something. He said, we're putting the rat in an empty cage. It's got nothing to do except use these drugs. Let's try something a bit different. So Professor Alexander built a cage that he called Rat Park, which is basically heaven for rats, right? They've got loads of cheese, they've got loads of colored balls, they've got loads of tunnels. Crucially, they've got loads of friends, they can have loads of sex, and they've got both the water bottles, the normal water and the drugged water. But here's the fascinating thing. In Rat Park, they don't like the drugged water. They almost never use it. None of them ever use it compulsively. None of them ever overdose. You go from almost 100% overdose when they're isolated to 0% overdose when they have happy and connected lives. Now, when he first saw this, Professor Alexander thought, maybe this is just a thing about rats. They're quite different to us, maybe not as different as we'd like, but, But fortunately, there was a human experiment into the exact same principle happening at the exact same time. It was called the Vietnam War. In Vietnam, 20% of all American troops were using loads of heroin. And if you look at the news reports from the time, they were really worried because they thought, my God, we're going to have hundreds of thousands of junkies on the streets of the United States when the war ends. It made total sense. Now, those soldiers who were using loads of heroin were followed home. The Archives of General Psychiatry did a really detailed study, and what happened to them? It turns out they didn't go to rehab. They didn't go into withdrawal. 95% of them just stopped. Now, if you believe the story about chemical hooks, that makes absolutely no sense. But Professor Alexander began to think there might be a different story about addiction. He said, what if addiction isn't about your chemical hooks? What if addiction is about your cage? What if addiction is an adaptation to your environment? Looking at this, there was another professor called Peter Cohen in the Netherlands who said, maybe we shouldn't even call it addiction. Maybe we should call it bonding. Human beings have a natural and innate need to bond. And when we're happy and healthy, we'll bond and connect with each other. But if you can't do that because you're traumatized or isolated or beaten down by life, you will bond with something that will give you some sense of relief. Now, that might be gambling, that might be pornography, that might be cocaine, that might be cannabis, but you will bond and connect with something because that's our nature. That's what we want as human beings. And I think, at first I found this quite a difficult thing to get my head around, but one way that helped me to think about it is, and I can see, I've got over by my seat there a bottle of water, right? I'm looking at lots of you, and lots of you have bottles of water with you, right? Forget drugs, forget the drug war. Totally legally, all of those bottles of water could be bottles of vodka, right? We could all be getting drunk, I might, after this. But we're not, right? Now, because you've been able to afford the approximately £1 gazillion that it costs to get into a TED Talk, I'm guessing you guys could afford to be drinking vodka for the next 6 months. You wouldn't end up homeless. You're not going to do that. And the reason you're not going to do that is not because anyone's stopping you. It's because you've got bonds and connections that you want to be present for. You've got work you love. You've got people you love. You've got healthy relationships. And a core part of addiction, I came to think, and I believe the evidence suggests, is about not being able to bear to be present in your life. Now, this has really significant implications. The most obvious implications are for the war on drugs, right? In Arizona, I went out with a group of women who were made to wear T-shirts saying I was a drug addict and go out on chain gangs and dig graves while members of the public could jeer at them. And when those women get out of prison, they're going to have criminal records that mean they'll never work in the legal economy again. Now, that's a very extreme example, obviously, in the case of the chain gang, but actually almost everywhere in the world we treat addicts to some degree like that. We punish them, we shame them, we give them criminal records, we put barriers between them reconnecting. There was a doctor in Canada, Dr. Gabor Mate, an amazing man, who said to me, if you wanted to design a system that would make addiction worse, you would design that system. Now, there's a place that decided to do the exact opposite, and I went there to see how it worked. In the year 2000, Portugal had one of the worst drug problems in Europe. 1% of the population was addicted to heroin, which is kind of mind-blowing. And every year, they tried the American way more and more. They punished people and stigmatized them and shamed them more. And every year, the problem got worse. And one day, the Prime Minister and the leader of the opposition got together and basically said, look, we can't go on with a country where we're having ever more people becoming heroin addicts. Let's set up a panel of scientists and doctors to figure out what would genuinely solve the problem. And they set up a panel led by an amazing man called Dr. Huao Gulao to look at all this new evidence. And they came back and they said, decriminalize all drugs, from cannabis to crack. But, and this is the crucial next step, take all the money we used to spend on cutting addicts off, on disconnecting them, and spend it instead on reconnecting them with the society. And that's not, essentially, that's not really what we think of. What they did wasn't really what we think of as drug treatment in the United States and Britain. So they do residential rehab, they do psychological therapy that does have some value. But the biggest thing they did was the complete opposite of what we do. A massive program of job creation for addicts and microloans for addicts to set up small businesses. So say you used to be a mechanic. When you're ready, they go to a garage and they'll say, if you employ this guy for a year, we'll pay half his wages. The goal was to make sure that every addict in Portugal had something to get out of bed for in the morning. And when I went and met the addicts in Portugal, it's fascinating. What they said is, as they rediscovered purpose, they rediscovered bonds and relationships with the wider society. It'll be 15 years this year since that experiment began, and the results are in. Injecting drug use is down in Portugal, according to the British Journal of Criminology, by 50%, 50%. Overdose is massively down. HIV is massively down among addicts. Addiction in every study is significantly down. One of the ways you know it's worked so well is that almost nobody in Portugal wants to go back to the old system. Now, that's the kind of political implications. I actually think there's a layer of implications to all this research below that. You know, we live in a culture where people feel really increasingly vulnerable to all sorts of addictions, whether it's to their smartphones or to shopping or to eating. You know, before these talks began, you guys know this, that we were told we weren't allowed to have our smartphones on. And I have to say, a lot of you looked an awful lot like addicts who were being told their dealer was going to be unavailable for the next couple of hours. And, you know, a lot of us feel like that. And it might sound weird to say, oh, you know, I've been talking about how disconnection is a major driver of addiction. But weird to say it's growing because you think, well, we're the most connected society there's ever been, surely. But I increasingly began to think that the connection we have, the connections we have, we think we have, are like a kind of parody of human connection. If you have a crisis in your life, you'll notice something. It won't be your Twitter followers who come to sit with you. It won't be your Facebook friends who help you turn it round. It'll be your flesh and blood friends who you have deep and nuanced and textured face-to-face relationships with. And I think there's a study I learned about from Bill McKibben, the environmental writer, I think tells us a lot about this. It looked at the number of close friends the average American believes they can call on in a crisis. That number has been declining steadily since the 1950s. The amount of floor space an individual has in their home has been steadily increasing. And I think that's like a metaphor for the choice we've made as a culture, right? We've traded floor space for friends, we've traded stuff for connections, and the result is that we are one of the loneliest societies there has ever been. And yet, Bruce Alexander, the guy who did the Rat Park experiment, says, we talk all the time in addiction about individual recovery, and it's right to talk about that, but we need to talk much more about social recovery. Something's gone wrong with us, not just as individuals, but as a group. And we've created a society where, for a lot of us, life looks a whole lot more like that isolated cage and a whole lot less like Rat Park. But if I'm honest, this isn't why I went into it, right? I didn't go in to discover the political stuff, the social stuff. I wanted to know how to help the people I love. And when I came back from this long journey and I'd learned all this, I looked at the addicts in my life, and if you're really candid, it's hard loving an addict, and there's going to be lots of people who know in this room you're angry a lot of the time. And I think one of the reasons why this debate is so charged is because it runs through the heart of each of us, right? Everyone has a bit of them that looks at an addict and thinks, I wish someone would just stop you. And the kind of script we're told for how to deal with the addicts in our life is typified by, I think, by the reality show Intervention. If you guys haven't seen it, I think everything in our lives is typified by reality TV, but that's another TED Talk. If you've never seen the show Intervention, it's a pretty simple premise. You get an addict, all the people in their life, gather them together, and say, if you don't shape up, confront them with what they're doing, and they say, if you don't shape up, we're going to cut you off, right? So what they do is they take the connection to the addict and they threaten it. They make it contingent on the addict behaving the way they want. And I began to see why that approach doesn't work. And I began to think that almost that's like the importing and the logic of the drug war into our private lives. So I was thinking, well, how can I be Portuguese, right? And what I try to do now, and I can't tell you I do it consistently, and I can't tell you it's easy, is to say to the addicts in my life that I want to deepen the connection with them, to say to them, I love you whether you're using or you're not. I love you whatever state you're in. And if you need me, I'll come and sit with you because I love you and I don't want you to be alone or to feel alone. And I think the core of that message, you're not alone, we love you, has to be at every level of how we respond to addicts, socially, politically, and individually. For 100 years now, we've been singing war songs about addicts. I think all along we should have been singing love songs to them, because the opposite of addiction is not sobriety. The opposite of addiction is connection. Thank you.
Okay, so can you guys hear me now? Okay. So there was a lot in that, and I know we're like getting close to the end here, but I want to hear from you guys. Did anything resonate with you? And what was it?
Absolutely. I mean, for me, what he said at the end about love, I mean, it's one of the things that I mean, I've known Killian at the Recovery Cafe since before the Recovery Cafe, and her approach is so consistent. It's like meeting people where they're at and loving them. And it's so powerful. So powerful. Yeah.
Thank you, Bruce. How about anyone else? Did anything resonate? John?
Yeah, I've noticed in my life persons who are addicts or alcoholics, whatever, what resonated with me, what he said is I can relate to certain individuals that, yeah, I saw where their isolation was, you know, where they may have felt isolated. They weren't, but they felt isolated, and that's why they got into the addiction they got into and refused, denied, whatever, to come out of it because they felt so alone out there. That does resonate with me when I look back at some of the individuals I've helped out and done things with, and the ones that were successful in staying sober, or you know, are the ones that rebuilt their life around them with other people and made more connections.
I think that's what a lot of people, most people have forgotten, is that we're herd animals. We belong with each other. And I live in an apartment by myself, along with 45 other people in their apartments by themselves. And it's the way it is. That's the normality, and it's wrong. And I think that's why there's so many connections, and probably why, more than just getting sick, the virus is going to really hurt us, in that we all have to be separate. Even when we're together, we have a mask over our face, which is one of our most important connections, is face to face.
Thank you, John, and thank you, Shirley. Did anyone else want to chime in about the video, how that landed with you?
Yeah, it was a really profound video to watch. I think, just adding to what everyone was saying, I think what I found most kind of striking about it was how subtle that lack of connection can be in society. I know I've just been thinking about kind of the alternative addictions I've experienced in my life personally, with a binge eating disorder and watching a family member be addicted to video gaming and sort of alternative ways of addiction that people don't normally think about, and kind of reflecting on how those people actually did have a lot of community around them at the time, but still felt some kind of void that needed to be filled. And I don't know, I guess just how subtle that lack of connection can be in people's lives just because of the way our society and structure seems to be built these days. And like you guys are saying, just how we are so isolated in the way that we live right now. So just reflecting on that, I guess.
Thank you, Caitlin. Something that we didn't have time for, and I alluded to a little bit earlier, was about, how do we maintain these connections right now? Obviously, we're all here together in this virtual space. I was going to ask Angel, what does treatment look like right now? And that'll have to be a discussion for another time. But it seems like a lot of you who have come here because you're interested in the Recovery Cafe at some level know already what he was just talking about in this video, right? Is that how important community is for recovery. And we're talking about recovery from all things. We've been focused a lot on addiction today, but we're talking about mental illness, addiction, homelessness, any life challenge. What we say at Recovery Cafe is that we're all in recovery from something. And I'm not here to tell you how to do it or what to do even, but that by being together in this space and meeting each other where they're at, like Bruce was saying, that maybe we can help each other out just by sharing our stories and listening to someone else's stories. I know it's helpful for me. So what I'll say is, for those of you who arrived here today in the training because you're interested in getting more involved in the Recovery Cafe, this is a good first step, showing up. When someone is first interested, what I ask them is to just get to know us a little bit, spend some time in these trainings with us together, connect with us either in a recovery circle if that's something you're interested in, or coming down to the cafe to get a tour. You can contact me about that. We have a couple volunteer committees that people are working on, like how does the food and kitchen operate, and how can we work on local issues that affect people in recovery here? How do we advocate for those? So there's ways to get involved, and the whole point though is to show up and just be yourself. That's all we're looking for here. So we have about 5 minutes left. Angel, I want to say thank you again. Is there anything that you'd like to impart with us before we leave today?
No, just always, you're all welcome to give me a call if you have any questions or comments or want to discuss anything. I'm here at Safe Harbor, and yeah.
Thank you so much. Can we give Angel a round of applause? Thank you so much for helping us out today.
Say, Brian, this is Kathy Espy, and regarding the committees, I'd just like to put in a plug for any aspiring cooks out there. We're definitely ramping up to and looking forward to providing some great and nutritious meals in the cafe. We're definitely in need of cooks.
I'd like to say something. Can I be heard?
Sure, go ahead. Oh, I think you hit your mute button there, Susanna.
Mute there. Okay. I spent a lot of my life moving around and looking for a place where I feel like I belong. Since I've been here for 2.5 years, I feel a very strong sense of connection, and I just come out of my body. I mean, I am spontaneous, and I see somebody that I look like it's friendly, I'll go right there and say hi, play around, make a joke, say something that might be interesting to them, and we get the smile, and that's sense of connection spontaneously helps people. It helps me, it helps everybody else that I try this on. And partly I do it as a result of the response of so much fear-based people walking around, they're scared. They have their mask on, they haven't had any intimacy for some time, and they're walking around afraid, and they don't know what else to do about it. So I just jump out, and it's fun. I think that's a healing thing. Thank you.
Thank you,
I have a
Susanna.
question of Angel. Angel, let's say somebody's living in the forest and they decide that they want to get sober. What steps do they take?
Find a place to live.
I mean, really, this is to keep it really brief. I mean, they could just walk up to our office, knock on the door, because right now the door is closed, but they can knock on the door and we'll get them started with the process. I mean, it's, there's intake and assessment, or they can call, but if they're living in the woods, they might not be able to. So they just come up here.
Well, they're broke. They don't have any money.
Sure. So they probably, if they're living in the woods, they probably qualify for Medicaid. So we could help get them set up with insurance. We do also have some low income funding that's available to us.
Yes.
For example, people on Medicare, we can't bill Medicare, but we have this low income funding that's available to us that we can give, basically apply to them. Yeah.
And Doug, maybe I'll get you and Angel connected if there's a specific case that you're speaking about. But we are at the end of our time today. I do want to say thank you all so much for your time and your contributions in our training. I'm going to be posting this on our website. So if you'd like to watch it again or share it with someone else, then you'll be able to do that. I want to say thank you again to Angel for taking the time to be here with us today. She's a great resource. Really liked working with you, Angel, and really respect her as a professional in this field. So thank you again, and goodbye, everyone. We'll see you next time.
Thank you, everybody. Bye. See you later.
Thank you, Brian.
Thank you, Brian. And Angel.
All right. Yeah, thanks, everybody.
Yeah.
Thanks, everybody.
Great gathering.
Thank you both. Thanks.
That was great. Thank you very much.
Yes.
It was just perfect.